All right, I'll go ahead and get started. Thank you to everyone for joining our session today on wages in the U.S. labor market. I'm Kate Bahn, the Chief Economist and Director of Labor Market Policy at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. Today's session will feature papers that broadly help us understand the economic phenomenon and policies that shape worker outcomes. I am so excited to hear our panelists present their cutting-edge research on wage dispersion, wage setting, and labor supply. The first paper presentation will be Benny Kleinman Orleansky, who's a doctoral candidate at Princeton University, presenting his paper on earnings inequality and the spatial expansion of firms. Benny's research investigates how the dispersion of firms across space within a headquarter branch establishment model impacts overall earnings inequality. Then immediately following will be Marta Lachowska, Senior Economist and Deputy Director of Research at the Upjohn Institute, providing discussant remarks. Following Marta will be Michael Reich, Professor of Economics and co-chair of the Center on Wage and Employment Dynamics at the Institute for Research on Labor and Employment of the University of California, Berkeley, who will present his new work, Are $15 Minimum Wages Too High?, which examines the large bite of California's minimum wage increases on employment levels. Following that, Johannes Schmieder, Associate Professor of Economics at Boston University, will present his work on the labor supply effect of unemployment insurance for older workers, which is our one paper with international data looking at reforms to unemployment insurance recipiency in Germany through policy changes. Following both of those papers will be David Autor, Professor of Economics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, who will provide discussion remarks on both papers. After all our speakers, we'll be opening up to audience questions and discussion. So throughout the presentation, feel free to submit questions through the Q&A function on the CVET platform, and I will moderate them for our presenters. With that, I will hand it off to Benny to start us.
Thank you very much, Kate. Hello, everyone. My name is Benny Kleinman. I'm a Ph.D. student at Princeton University. I will present my project, Wage Inequality in the Spatial Expansion of Firms. And first of all, I would like to thank Equitable Growth for their generous support and for organizing this session. This project is still in early presentation stages, so any feedback will be greatly appreciated. And of course, I have only 10 minutes, so I'll just highlight key features from the paper. Okay, so first, the standard sentence disclaimer: the project represents only my own views and not that of the centers. Okay, so the motivation for this project is a key trend in the US economy in recent decades, in which multi-location firms that operate establishments across multiple local markets are increasingly prevalent. So this can most easily seen in the fact that the average number of establishments per firm has been steadily rising in recent decades, and we see this trend across a wide range of service sectors. So in this project, they studied the labor market implications of this trend, and they provide a framework that links the spatial nature of firm expansion to changes in wage inequality in recent decades. So at the core of the mechanism that links this type of firm spatial expansion to changes in inequality is the way that firms are organized in space. So in particular, I focus on a very common form of organization in which local service providers are linked together to joint headquarters. So examples to such local branches can be banks, restaurants, healthcare providers, warehouses, fulfillment centers, and so on. And they highlight two key ideas on this type of firm organization. First of all, when firms expand, when they become larger, they expand in space. So they need to open more and more establishments in more markets in order to grow. And secondly, different branches are linked not just by name, but they share common technology that is determined by hiring labor at the firm headquarters. So in this framework, large firms have interesting characteristics, and they are characterized by larger differences in wages and for demand per skill between the headquarters and the branches. So firms' expansion is not innocuous. Let me give you one example to make this more concrete, which is the case of Shake Shack's expansion, which is a famous hamburger chain. They started in New York City, and as we can see in online job postings data from Burning Glass, we can see that they increased their activity across many cities in the past decade. When we look at on their online job postings, we see that they post most of the new postings are in all these new locations, while many of them are still in the original market of New York. But then when we look at the skill intensity of these postings, as measured by the percent of postings that require a college degree, we see that in most locations, they're relatively skill unintensive, while in New York, they become increasingly more and more skill intensive. So this is a change only at the firm level, but we know that the average firm in the economy has expanded in such way. So we should expect that this kind of mechanism to have interesting aggregate implications. Okay, so in particular, when in such framework, when the costs to expansion goes down, it yields rich implications for inequality across multiple dimensions, both within the firm and across space. So I explore this mechanism in the model in the paper in 3 parts. I provide some stylus facts on multi-region service firms. I provide a model of this type of headquarter branch networks, and I estimate the model and conduct counterfactuals to study the quantitative importance of this mechanism. I use two key data sources for this project. The first one is the Census Longitudinal-Based Business Database that allows me to connect the changes in the wage distribution across establishments to the structure of firms. And secondly, I complement it with some data from online job postings from Burning Glass, which I merged together with firm linkages from Dun and Bradstreet. So I document 4 key stylus facts. 3 of them are on changes between 1980 and 2017. The first effect is just that these firms have expanded significantly over time, and mostly at the extensive margin. So firms expand by opening this new type of establishments. The second fact is that multi-region service firms account for most of the rise in wage inequality across establishments in recent decades. So one simple way to see it is to look at the variance of log wages across establishments in the US. The black line showed the overall trend after taking away industry fixed effects. So that's within industry inequality rising over time. When we separate it into single establishment firms or multi-establishment firms, we see very mild increase in inequality, if any at all, across single establishment firms, but a very sharp increase across multi-establishment firms. Focusing more narrowly on this type of multi-region service firms, I show through a variance decomposition that they account to close to 70% of the total rise of variance of log wages. The third fact is that close to half of the role in the total increase in inequality is due to rising inequality within the firms across different establishments. So this motivates the focus on the firm structure and the headquarter branch distinction. And finally, it provides some evidence for the specific structure that I suggest of the headquarter branch network, in which headquarter activity is spatially concentrated and highly skill intensive, while branch activity is spatially dispersed. Okay, after documenting the stylus facts, I develop a model of this headquarter branch networks and their expansion. It's an economic geography model that I map into 391 labor market areas in the US. Households in this model come from different skill groups and choose location and employer. Firms choose where to set their headquarters and branches, and they hire label for both. So this is in principle a complex environment with a lot of location choices, but I show that it can achieve tractable aggregation. And because of the structure of the firms that I highlighted before, the model yields rich predictions for wage inequality across firms, because larger firms, as in many other settings, pay higher wages on average, but uniquely to this setting, there's large inequality within the firm that grows as the firms expand in space, and in particular, we see an increase in the headquarter branch wage gap in line with the data. Finally, it yields also very natural implications for spatial inequality, because these headquarters tend to concentrate in equilibrium in large and skilled cities. When I take the model to the data, I use it to recover the implied cost to firm expansion and how it changed over time from the universe of headquarter branch linkages. And what we can see here is the average cost to serve the distant markets as a function of the distance of the branch from the firm headquarter. And we see that this cost is increasing in distance, which makes sense. And it declines over time due to improvements in communication in transportation technologies. When I started the 1980 equilibrium in the model, and I feed in this decline in the cost to expansion, so quite naturally we see firms expand in space, and then it also accounts for much of the rising inequality in recent decades, speaking jointly to these different dimensions that I highlight, both between and within firms and across space. Finally, the model has some natural implications to the geographic distribution of economic activity. So on the x-axis across all these plots, I show the 1980 specialization in services that captures how specialized the region is, a local market is in offering this type of headquarters services. So for example, the one here is New York City. And we see that the wage growth is strongest in locations like New York following this decline in costs of expansion. These locations also see an increase in the house prices and the decline in the price index of services. When we take the wages and decompose it into different components, we see that the increase in wages is driven by headquarter wages in locations such as New York City. And finally, we also find in the model an increase in the wage gap between skilled and unskilled labor because headquarter activity is very skill intensive. Okay, so to conclude, the main takeaways that I want you to get out with is, first of all, that multi-region service firms account for a larger part of the economy and for most of the rise in wage inequality. That modeling them in this form of headquarter branch networks is beneficial and yields a wide range of predictions for inequality, both across and within firms and across space. And in my preferred counterfactual, around 40% of the within industry inequality across establishments in the US can be accounted by a decline in the cost of firm expansion across space. I don't do policy analysis in the paper, but I think that this kind of a firm structure and its expansion has interesting policy implications, like the risk of intensified headquarter competition, as we've seen, for example, in the case of Amazon's second headquarter, and be happy to talk more about it in the Q&A session if somebody asks. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Benny. That was super interesting. And I'll hand it off to Marta for her discussant remarks.
Okay. Thank you so much for the opportunity to read and discuss this paper, which, despite Benny saying it's quite preliminary, I found it actually quite far along and mature. My comments will mostly focus on.
Sorry to briefly interrupt you, Marta.
Oh, yeah.
I can't see your slides.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Is your screen sharing? But there they are. Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay, I was just at the introductory slide, so thank you. So my comments will mostly focus on possible future directions of the paper. So just to give you my summary of the takeaways of the paper. So as Benny presented, the paper has both an empirical and a theoretical part, and most of my comments will focus on the empirics. So what the paper convincingly shows is that increase in wage inequality is related to increases in the average number of establishments per firm, and this is particularly due to firms that operate across multiple regions. So as Benny's examples were Walmart, Bank of America, or McDonald's. So then the paper decomposes the growth and wage inequality into a between and a within industry component, demonstrates that both are important, and following kind of like a Russian doll unpacks the different components of the increase in inequality. So what we see, for example, is that the growth of within industry inequality is accounted for by these multi-establishment firms operating in multiple regions, and that they are quite different from the single establishment firms. So, for example, the pay structure at a Bank of America is different than the pay structure at a local credit union, although they're in the same financial services industry. Then the inequality within the multi-establishment firms is then related to this gap in the compensation structure between the headquarters of the firm and then the branch establishments. So, for example, the pay gap between the executives at a Bank of America, to kind of continue with that example, relative to the pay structure of the bank tellers of the Bank of America branch. To do this, the paper uses establishment level data from the LBD from the 1980s to 2017. And the neat feature of these data is that you have information on the establishment's total employment, payroll, you have the NAICS code, location, and the identity of that establishment's parent firm. So that's the firm's EIN, which allows Benny then to group these establishments to to be a firm. So just to again give you an example, you have the Walmart supercenters, which are the establishments, and then all of those then can be linked to the Walmart Incorporated firm or EIN. So the paper demonstrates really a lot of careful data work that perhaps didn't come across quite in the presentation, but it's really quite impressive. Given that this is establishment level data, there's no direct worker level data, but then there is the data from the Burning Glass technologies, which use information on a firm's job posting in a specific location to kind of get the sense of who does this firm demand, who do they employ. So as a sanity check, we find that headquarters demand financial analysts or marketing people, tend to be more higher skilled occupations, whereas branches, they hire drivers or salespeople, for example. So this is an impressive paper. I really enjoyed reading it, and it furthers the existing body of evidence, the growing body of evidence on the role of the employer in explaining growing inequality, and it succeeds in combining literatures of various sorts. For example, the work on geography of jobs, industrial organization, AKM style work, and the work on market power in the labor market. Now, my comments reflect my background as a labor economist who has spent the past 7 years or so marinating in variance decompositions of worker and firm fixed effects models. So please bear that in mind where my comments are coming from. But coming from this world, I'm used to looking at this issue from both the firm and the worker perspective, that they both contribute to wage inequality. And so I wondered when reading the paper, and how knowing these new facts about the role of multi-establishment firms, in particular those operating across many regions, how that changes what we would know about returns to ability, the firm wage premium, and also the sorting of workers to firms. So the sort of standard variance decompositions that AKM model provide. I mean, it seems there'd be something different about these multi-establishment firms. To be more specific, and I know this is a tall order, to ask for more data from the census, but just to offer a background, the AKM literature typically will use the EIN as the employer identity, and then identifies the firm wage effect through worker mobility between employers, right? And this firm wage effect that you estimate is the firm wage component that's common to all the employees of that firm. But it seems to me that given these facts that the paper presents, such overall firm wage effect could be misleading if there is a distinct HQ wage component and separate branch wage components. So it'll be interesting as a future direction, perhaps, to know, to estimate whether there are different firm wage effects for the headquarters of those firms and the branches. Among other comments, I thought the paper could link a bit more to the more recent literature on the employer market power. So there's several papers by Jose Azar and co-authors. And for example, how does the growth of these multi-establishment firms relate to increased labor market concentration? And how do they affect the employer's ability to set wages below a competitive level? And as a final kind of a laundry list of questions that came to mind when I was reading the paper was that because the location of these firms, I thought it would be really fun to know more about the geography of expansion of these multi-establishment firms. So where in the US concretely is expansion occurring? Are there patterns? Is it in the Sun Belt, for example? Is that where the direction takes place first? Then it'll be interesting to know what the effect of expansion is on the wages in the local labor markets, for the other jobs in the area. And also, as the HQ, as the firm is expanding, is there the firm component in the HQ drifting? I mean, I guess that reflects back to my own work on stability of firm pay policies, but that would be really interesting to know. And also, how pay structure is different as a function to distance to the HQ. I know that you showed some distance style calibration exercises, but just from the data, whether it's there are any patterns there. But I just wanted to say I really enjoyed reading the paper, and I would love to see the further direction it's taking. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Marta. And also echoing how much I enjoyed reading this paper. I'm really excited to see this work come out and take shape. So I will now hand it off to our next presenter, which is Michael Reich.
How are we doing? Can you see me? Yeah, okay, now I'm going to share my screen and turn on the slides. Okay, so this paper is joint work with Carl McPherson and Justin Wilshire. It's a brand new paper. This is our only second time presenting it, so we're really eager to get comments. What we do is we study minimum wage employment effects at the $15 and actually higher level using a synthetic control method. And our focus is on California, which is the first state to reach $15 in January of this year. It had not increased its minimum wage between 2009 and 2014. And then since then, the minimum wage has gone up 87.5%, which is quite remarkable compared to minimum wage events before 2015, say. And in some counties in California, Fresno County is the lowest wage county. The ratio of the minimum wage to median wage is as high as 82%. And our control group are the areas, in particular counties, without a minimum wage change since 2009. I'll get into that more in a moment. But to give you some perspective, in the Chengiz et al. QJE paper, which is really the landmark and standard bearer for minimum wage research these days, the highest minimum wage was $12. The average increase was 10% for each minimum wage event, and the highest minimum wage to median wage ratio is 59%. So we're really moving much farther in the policy here, and research has not kept up with it. Our goal is to catch up on the research. Here's the schedule of the minimum wage changes. As you can see, from 2008 to 2014, the minimum wage excuse me, was $8, and then it changed from July 1st to 9, and it's been going up gradually to 15, as I mentioned, an 87.5% cumulative increase over these years. This slide shows you the reach of the minimum wage using the median wage as a benchmark, and you can see the top two lines are for teens and for food service or restaurant workers. And you can see that those are well above 90%, or even 100% in the case of teens over this period. That is remarkable. That usually scares people to hear numbers like this. The green line here is for Fresno County, which I mentioned before, and you can see the increase in the ratio, and that is in the reach of the policies, up to well over 80% in 2020. The blue line is for California as a whole. You see an increase, but not as severe, as dramatic, but definitely an increase in the reach of the policies. The bottom line, the red line, is San Francisco, which has had a minimum wage equivalent to $13 today that began in 2003. And it's now well above $16, almost $17. And these are indexed, by the way, annually. So it will continue to go up. But you can see that San Francisco comes in here as a high median wage city, which it is. But many of the other cities with minimum wages are not high wage. Okay. This is a very simple kind of motivating example. We have California and Texas in this slide, and it's just the descriptive data. We have marked California in blue and Texas in red. The colors are not accidental. And as you can see, from 2009 to 2014, the wages, this is in restaurants, grew at the same level, at the same rate in both states. This is not to say the levels are the same, this is the growth. And, but then they began to diverge as soon as California started raising its minimum wage and continue to diverge ever since. On the right panel, you see the same kind of a chart, but for employment in restaurants. And here what's interesting and important is that the minimum wage, do I need to get rid of the people on my screen? Or can you see all the way to the end of the chart?
I think it's fine.
It's fine. Okay, because I'm seeing you guys, which I is blocking some of the screen. Okay, anyway, so what you see here is that the employment levels track each other again from 2009 to 2014, and they continue to do that all the way through the beginning of 2022. And that is kind of our motivating example to show that maybe minimum wages as high as $15 or higher have not affected employment. Of course, there are other things that could affect these graphs. For example, maybe the minimum wage did reduce employment in California, but California grew faster than Texas. So we really have to do a more careful analysis. This is just to motivate what's coming. So we use a synthetic control method. It's not been used that often in minimum wages, and when it has often been misused. Our treatment units are the 26 most populous counties in California. California has 58 counties, but these counties account for 95% of the workforce. And we use county level data because it gives us more variation and therefore more precise estimates. The donor pool for synthetic California consists of the 124 counties in, I think it's 20 states that have had the same minimum wage from 2009 to 2022. In other words, they're still at $7.25 at the federal level. And when we checked to see was this a reasonable donor pool, it turns out that they are similar to California, not too different, in the percent of teens in the workforce and the percent who are restaurant workers. So what a synthetic control algorithm does is chooses weights from the donor pool to best match the pre-treatment experience of California on changes in pay and employment for the study groups such as teens or restaurant workers. And the synthetic California then uses those weights. It was defined by those weights. It's a weighted average of the donor pool. So the estimated effect is in California minus synthetic California. And unlike previous synthetic control estimates, we average estimates among the 26 counties. Again, as I said, to give us a little more precision. Here's our main results. And on the left, we have weekly earnings, on the right, employment. And you can see that the California 26 county average hugs the horizontal axis in the pre-period, 2009 to 2014, and so do the donors. The gray lines are basically placebo averages that tell you how much variation there is depending on which donor you're comparing to. And then what happens after 2014 is that wages start to rise faster in California. The little gray bands here are confidence intervals. There is a dip with the pandemic, particularly as it affected restaurants, and the lockdowns in California were more severe and earlier than in other states. But then what's remarkable is by the end of 2021 and to 2022, the wage growth has come back to where it would have been if you just connected the lines, ignoring the pandemic years, just do a line connecting them. Turning to the employment graph, again, the pre-treatment fit is very good. This is very important for synthetic control method. If you don't have a good pre-treatment fit, you're probably having some problems. Although there are more sophisticated methods to correct those now. And again, you see that the employment effect, the blue line, is not that different from the gray lines, with a big dip in during the pandemic lockdowns, but then coming right back up to where it was before. And then down below, we list the quantitative effect, the treatment effect, raised the average weekly earnings, this QCW data, so we have weekly earnings by 17%, and that's with a p-value of 0.01. We're pretty happy with that, and the employment effect is not significant. This is the same chart, but for fast food workers who've been in the fast food industry has been in the crosshairs lately in California for minimum wage policy. And it really shows the same thing, except a somewhat bigger increase in wages. That is, it's now 22% instead of 17%, exactly what you'd expect, since fast food workers are lower wage than restaurant workers as a whole. This result is for teen workers, and we had to smooth the data to get the signal, extract the signal from the noise. It's a smaller sample of CPS data, but again, and there's a lag in the effect because of the smoothing, but again, we have pretty good pre-fit, and then an increase in wages that's pretty substantial. It's about, for teens, it comes in at 23%, and by 2019, it's going to be a little bit lower by 2022, but that's still pretty remarkable. And the p-value is 0.05, so just barely significant for that standard. Employment on the right axis actually goes up for teens, and this surprised us. There seems to be some labor supply effect at these wage levels that other people have not found, but it's pretty noisy data. Our p-value is 0.1, so we don't put a huge amount of emphasis on this. We also do find, and I didn't show this in this chart, an increase in hours worked of which comes in with a p-value of 0.05, which also is contrary to previous studies. But these are consistent with what's been happening to teen employment rates, which have really risen in the United States in the last 5 years or so, after a dramatic decline around 2000 and since, unrelated to the minimum wage. But teen workers are coming back, perhaps because there are fewer people who are immigrants in the workforce, in the restaurant work, or in the low-wage workforce. Then this chart, it's modeled after one in the Cengiz et al. Paper. It shows what's going on for all jobs, not just for teens or for restaurant workers. And it collects the data in such a way to show you what happens in $1 wage bins after a new minimum wage. So it's kind of a bin by bin event study, you can call it, except that in our case, we derive it from our synthetic control method results. And what you see here is, as one expects, that the jobs just below, that pay just below the new minimum wage go down after the new minimum wage arrives, and the jobs, or pay in jobs just above the minimum wage goes up. Not quite as much as the decrease, but then there are hints of positive minimum wage effects, spillover effects, $1, $2 above. $4 one is pretty interesting. I've looked at that in another paper on black-white inequality, and where the difference is more dramatic. In any case, the other thing that's important about this graph is that we don't see any minimum wage effects where we shouldn't see them. That is to say, in very high wage bins. And this is an important test. It's one that, for example, the old University of Washington study of Seattle would fail because it was clearly picking up their methods, their synthetic control methods, or rather their data, was just picking up what's going on in Washington, in Seattle versus the rest of the state. It turns out Seattle experienced a shock, an economic boom, tech boom, that was not experienced in the rest of the state. So you could ask about our results. Well, what do we do to check also for such confounding effects? And the next slide, I'm not going to show you these results because of the time constraint, But we do look at differences in unemployment rates, GDP growth, and housing price growth, all of which changed much more in California than in our donor pool. We do a couple of placebo tests. We look at other policies that might have confounding effects, like California introduced a big EITC. It has a more generous Medi-Cal program, and there was more enforcement after the minimum wage went into effect. So it turns out there was also more enforcement in the rest of the US also. Anyway, none of these changed our results in any way. And then we have other robustness tests using the data at the state level instead of the county level. We do an event study of teens, use this raw data versus the smooth data. And as I've said, we've looked at the effects of the COVID lockdowns. All of these seem to still give us the same answers. So to conclude, I hope I'm running okay on time. We use really four, in the paper as a whole, we have four estimating methods, two of the synthetic control methods, including kind of a stacking or averaging approach, which is using the 26 counties. We also have the bin by bin results from synthetic control methods, not from event studies. And we do have some event studies to display as well. Two different data sets, many robustness tests. They all point in the same direction, that minimum wages increase wages, but even at this level, they do not cause disemployment, which should give some comfort to people who are talking about even higher minimum wages. So thank you. This is a link to our emails and to the working paper itself, now posted on the Institute for Research and Labor Employment's website. Thank you again.
Great. Thank you, Michael. You went a little long, but our last two are a little short. So I wanted you to keep going and keep hearing about your work. And thank you for presenting that. And next up will be Johannes Schmieder presenting on labor supply effects.
Hi. Yeah. Let me share my screen. Sorry.
And Johannes, we're seeing like the, oh, there you go. Perfect.
Okay. Yeah. So I will talk about labor supply effect of unemployment insurance, and that's joint work with 4 other co-authors. Now, so there has been a lot of interest in unemployment insurance, once again in the pandemic. And kind of the key trade-off that is usually discussed and that much of the economics literature has focused on is this trade-off between providing help to unemployed workers, basically the insurance component, to cover costs while they're unemployed, pay their mortgage, and so on, while also keeping in mind that potentially providing unemployment insurance can reduce incentives, or does reduce incentives to look for a job, and leads to people on average being unemployed longer. And this has been kind of shown over and over again in various contexts for younger workers, but it really focuses on this sort of less job search. In this paper, we make an argument there's another channel that is particularly relevant for older workers, namely that unemployment insurance can induce older workers to essentially permanently leave employment by using unemployment insurance as essentially a bridge to retirement. So to kind of bridge the gap between dropping out of the labor force until they can claim a pension. And that can really lead to sort of, quantitatively large inflows into unemployment. And we studied this in the context of Germany over a period of 4 decades, so a very long time frame, starting from the early 1980s, more or less until today. And we basically will show that there's very sharp bunching, so a large mass of workers who enter UI right at certain ages where it's particularly convenient to use unemployment insurance as a bridge to retirement. And then we basically want to quantify the total effect of that in a way that we can make statements about what the total effect is of unemployment insurance on the unemployment rate for older workers, and also talk about potential counterfactuals under other policy regimes. And to do that, we estimate a a structural life cycle model that basically estimates how people respond, or models how people respond to the various incentives, including the interaction of the UI system and the retirement system in Germany. So to motivate this, let me show you a graph that I find very striking. So these are unemployment rates for Germany and the United States. The red lines are the unemployment rates for the United States, and the blue lines for Germany, and they are broken up by different age groups. So you can see, basically, let's look for the US groups. These are 5-year bins, 35, 39, 50 to 54, 55 to 59, and 60 to 64. And you can see that in the US, they're basically on top of each other. There's so small variation, but they're very close to each other. They're very similar in terms of how they vary over the business cycle. In Germany, 3 out of those 4 groups are also fairly close to each other, but then one group is really striking. So you can see the age group of 55 to 59 starts out at a similar level as the overall unemployment rate in the early 80s, but then starts going up and up and up. It eventually reaches 16%, which is almost twice as high than for workers who are just a little bit younger or just a little bit older. Right? So especially compared to a little bit younger, this is like way higher. And then eventually this converges back down. And what we argue in this paper is that a sizable part of that is due to this mechanism that UI is used as a bridge into early retirement. And that's basically what I'm trying to show you. So to give you a flavor of what I mean by UI bridge to retirement, so this varies kind of over our 4 decades, but the basic mechanism is always there, that basically workers at some point can claim pension benefits in sort of the German version of the social security system. And in particular, for long periods, they were able to go into retirement, meaning they could claim pension benefits at age 60 if they were unemployed before. And moreover, before that, they were able to receive unemployment insurance. So for example, for the 1924 birth cohort, so that's the cohort that is 60 in 1984, so the early 80s, workers were able to get 12 months of unemployment insurance benefits. And so essentially what that allows workers is to leave a job at age 59, then claim UI benefits for 12 months, and then directly go into early retirement. So in a way, they could use UI to sort of move the early retirement age even earlier. That's what we mean by bridge to retirement, right? So the question is that sort of a relevant channel, right? So just because in principle people can do this, of course, does not mean that we observe this in practice. And so we simply created figures that show the inflows into unemployment insurance by age. So I'll show you this first for the 1924 cohort. And essentially each dot here shows how many workers in that cohort in a given month are entering UI. And so you can see that this is for a long time quite low, and it slowly increases. Here the dashed line is the unemployment rate in Germany, so there's also a period when the unemployment rate is going up. And then right at age 59, so basically in the month that people turn 59, you suddenly see like a huge jump upwards in how many people claim unemployment benefits. And then it stays a little bit higher and it goes down again. So there are a lot of people, and this is like a sizable part of the sizable fraction of that entire birth cohort. And like I think in this year about 4 or 5% enter UI right at the time when they can use this as a bridge to retirement. So they enter at age 59 and then go into retirement afterwards. Now, if you just show you 1 year, you might think, well, maybe there's something else going on at age 59, and who knows. So luckily, from our perspective, for showing that there's an effect, we have a lot of reforms in the system. And for example, 5 years later, so in the 1929 cohort, the duration, how long people could get UI benefits, increased by 12 months. So it doubled. And so you would expect that now people can bridge to retirement at age 58, because now they can go into UI at 58 and then stay on UI for 2 years and then go into early retirement. And in fact, we see now a huge spike in the UI inflows right at age 58. There continues to be a little spike at age 59. which is likely because you still had to be unemployed for at least a year in order to qualify for this. But you still see this massive movement of the spike to 58. And we think this is sort of pretty convincing evidence that people respond to this mechanism and really use UI as a bridge to retirement. And in the paper, we basically show this for like 6 more cohorts, and you can see very nicely how this line moves along with this bridge age. Now, so we think that's pretty compelling evidence that this bridge to UI mechanism matters quantitatively, but it is hard to really quantify what the total effect of that is on say the unemployment rate or the total time out of work. And it's hard to know from this what the counterfactual would be if we change parts of the system. And so to better analyze this, we developed a model, which is a life cycle model of labor supply that models for a large number of heterogeneous agents how they make labor supply decisions in this kind of environment, and how they make, in particular, how do they decide on transitions between employment and unemployment, which can be either voluntary or involuntary. And then if they are unemployed, how much they are searching for a job. And so, we developed this model, and then we estimate this using basically these figures of UI inflows as a way to pin down the parameters of the model. And so, without going into the details of the model, it's fairly complex. We can show how well the model does in explaining our data. So here I show you basically for these 2 cohorts, the 24 and the 29 cohort, what the data is, and then what the model, how well the model can explain that. So in the model, we use quarterly data, not monthly data. That's why the graphs just look a tiny bit different. But basically, the solid lines are the empirical UI inflows, and then the dashed line here is what the model predicts. And you can see the model does quite well in capturing this spike, for example, in the 1924 cohort at age 59. It also does quite well in the 1929 cohort to match the spike at age 58. And the model has about 12 parameters and has to fit sort of a lot of different things here. Right? So we think like overall this model does a really nice job in capturing sort of the main features of the data. And then the nice thing, once you have a model like this is, and we can convince us that it sort of provides a reasonable explanation, we can then investigate what happens if we change different institutional parameters. So for example, we can take the 1929 cohort and we can ask, what if unemployment benefits were still, the duration of unemployment benefits were still at the same level as in 1929? And so all else equal, how would the UI inflows shift? And so that's what we show here. So this is the UI inflows in 1929. And then the model prediction, if we change the potential UI duration from 24 months to 12 months. And indeed, the model would predict that the spike now moves again to 59 with a certain magnitude. Right? In fact, it looks very similar to the 1924 cohort that I showed you above before. And then kind of the motivating graph I showed you are these unemployment rates by age. And so what we can do then is basically within the sample that we use for our model, we can calculate unemployment rates in every year, so in every calendar year. And then we can use the model to produce counterfactual unemployment rates, where we show basically in each year, what would the unemployment rate have been if unemployment rates had remained constant. And so here it's important to note that basically in Germany, the potential duration of unemployment benefits was increased in the early 80s. It reached almost 3 years in the 90s, and then it was decreased again to eventually 2 years. And so essentially, the dark blue line that you can see here is the unemployment rate, is the actual empirical unemployment rate that our model captures quite well. And then the sort of less dark blue dashed line here is the counterfactual if the unemployment rate, if the potential unemployment benefit duration had remained at 12 months. And so you can see basically the difference between the 2 lines is how much of that huge increase in the unemployment rate for older workers is explained by the more generous UI system and this bridge to retirement mechanism of UI. And so that's kind of the main takeaway from the paper. So we show that UI is of course an important tool to help unemployed workers. But for older workers, it has this potential large effect of inducing people to leave their jobs and entering UI and then use it as a pathway into retirement. And this was a pretty large effect. Right? So in Germany, like the magnitude is like 3 percentage points increase in the unemployment rate. So especially in a world where you're more and more concerned about an aging workforce that should probably work longer for the economy to function well, we think this is an important channel to keep in mind. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Johannes. And finally, I'll hand it off to David for discussant remarks on the previous 2 papers.
Great, thank you. Let me see if I can share the screen. Okay, so you hopefully, and let me just do one quick thing so I can see you too. All right, hopefully you see my iPad screen.
Yes.
So first of all, thank you. It's great that the Washington Center for Equitable Growth is supporting all this cool scholarship. And I enjoyed reading both papers. I also enjoyed hearing papers, including Benny's paper, which he and I actually discussed, I think, when I was visiting Princeton last spring. So it's exciting to see it in action. So these 2 papers are unrelated and my comments will be orthogonal. They will have nothing to do with one another. But let me first talk about the paper by Carl McPherson, Michael Reich, and Justin Wiltshire, probably. So the context is California's 7-year minimum wage hike blitz. There was no change in the California minimum wage between 2008 and mid-2014, and then it was hiked to $9, then in increments up to $15 an hour recently. Now, the paper doesn't actually analyze the $15 an hour period, as far as I understand it. It's sort of, I think the title is rhetorical, is $15 too high? Well, the other ones don't appear to be too high in the paper's analysis, and so maybe 15 isn't either. Michael can correct me if I'm misunderstanding that. So Michael showed this figure, minimum wage, showing how binding these are, but I have to say, I had a slightly different takeaway from this figure, which was, so these are the fraction of workers earning under the upcoming minimum wage at each hike. And what you can see over this period is these fractions are incredibly stable, except if we look at Fresno. So in some sense, the minimum wage is binding, but it's not actually becoming more binding as it rises, or not much more binding, except in the lowest wage places. So it actually, that caused me to think a little bit more about how I understand this experiment. I'll come back to that in a minute. But I do think that fact, so it is incredibly binding, that is very clear. But throughout this very large period of hikes, it's actually position relative to the median, or for certain groups, isn't changing very much, which kind of affects how you might think about the experiment. One reason, of course, is there is inflation in this period. So the nominal minimum wage hike is substantially smaller than the real minimum wage hike, although still significant. So, in 2021, it's $14 an hour. And in 2009, it was 10. So in real terms, it's still a 40% increase, which is substantial. Okay, so I have 3 sets of comments. The first comment is, this is a really nice paper. There's a lovely visual exposition of the evidence. There's really good state-of-the-art methods, synthetic controls as per Abadi. And these are estimated by county and stacked, so it avoids the kind of negative weighting problem that's come up in other difference in difference papers. There's many cuts of the data. So it's clearly, the results are clearly robust to numerous sensible choices. So I showed this figure. These are the kind of average county effects estimated. So here's earnings. Here's employment, clearly earnings going up, employment is not going down relative to the donor group. You can look at a state level version of this for teenage workers. Very clearly, these minimum wage hikes seem to have boosted hourly wages and no obvious effect on employment. And this figure, I think, this bin figure, as per Linder and Hartosi, or then Senge's et al. Paper in the QJE, I think is really compelling, that we see all the action is at the bottom of the wage distribution, not here. And so in some sense, this is some of the questions I'm going to raise in a minute. I think this figure in some sense responds to them. But so this is, I think, really one of the most compelling pieces of evidence in the entire paper. So there are many exercises I mentioned to confirm the robustness. There's placebo treatment counties, there's placebo treatment timing, there's bias correction for imperfect synthetic controls, there's controlling for the fall in unemployment because it fell a lot in California. There's controlling for change in state GDP. State California rose a lot. There's controlling for state house prices, and there's a lot more. So clearly, this paper is extremely thorough. So now I have two kind of, comments that raise some questions. The first is about what synthetic controls can and cannot fix. So an important thing to realize in this period is California is booming. So its nominal minimum wage rose by 75%, but its nominal household income rose by 52% in this period. So it's really a very rapidly growing state. And that's part of the reason these minimum wages don't appear to keep binding more and more even as they rise, is because the whole wage structure is moving. And so arguably, and this is true for most synthetic control studies, California's large minimum wage hike is an N of one case study. There's no escaping that. Doesn't matter how many counties you use. It's one state. And this is true for the old Carter-Kruger, Pennsylvania, New Jersey minimum wage study. If you were to submit that paper to a journal today, it would be rejected because you're just comparing two states. This is, maybe that's a bit unfair. We have a lot of county variation in here, but ultimately those counties are going to have correlated effects because they are all in one state in which incomes are rising very rapidly. So if California booms or slumps relative to the rest of the nation during this period, the synthetic controls may not provide a valid counterfactual, right? So the issue is a parallel trends violation. The synthetic control approach is a lot like diff and diff, but you have untreated groups that are chosen by matching on pretreatment covariates levels and trends rather than just this state versus that state. So you can think of this as a difference in difference design, and it's subject to the same possible concerns that you could have trends that are not parallel during the treatment period. So counterfactually, what would have happened in California absent the change in minimum wage may not be identical to what would have happened in the donor counties, which didn't have a minimum wage increase. And that's just a question of you may have correlated shocks. Now, Michael referenced this in his discussion. You can get unlucky with N of one case studies. So this is what happened to the minimum wage study in Seattle by Jardim et al. And they noted in their abstract of their paper that relative to outlying regions in the state identified as synthetic control method, aggregate wages, employment at wages less than twice the original minimum measured by total hours worked declined. A portion of this reduction reflects jobs transitioning to wages above the threshold. So, the aggregate analysis likely overstates employment effects. So they're just acknowledging correctly that Seattle was on a different trend, or the trend, maybe one that kicked in as the minimum wage was hiked. And so the consequence was the comparison to outlying Seattle regions was not as tight a control as you would like. Now, this paper is much stronger than that because, of course, they show that figure of that bar graph of where wages change. But even so, I think the concern still lives. So let's think about the donor pool of states. These are a who's who of low wage states, not by accident. These are states that didn't raise their minimum wages between 2009 and present. Where are those states? Well, they're basically these red states. These are low wage parts of the country. They're places that have very different policy environments. And many of them, by the way, are growing faster than California, not in terms of income levels, but in terms of employment levels. These are attracting populations. These are low cost places to live, places like Texas in particular. And so you are comparing places that are starting at very different levels when you compare them to California on average, although not to all counties in California. So I found that a bit concerning. Here's the thing here's a comparison of the California versus the donor pool. And one thing that really caught my eye is if we look at teens, right, and their employment rate, let's see if, yes, that may not be perfect, but all right, you can see what I'm getting at, right? In California, the teen employment rate was 18% at the start of the period. It was 29% in the donor pool. And California, it rose to 22, it rose to 33 in the donor pool. But those are very different levels initially. So I don't know if I really think, how comfortable I am thinking of the donor pool as a really close comparison. Now, Michael put up the following figures by accident. I know he's going to put this up, but he showed a comparison of California and Texas. And you can see earnings diverge in California relative to Texas, and employment does not. And this is restaurant employment. Now, Michael caveated that this is not a controlled comparison, and that's absolutely right. Because if you look at California versus Texas, They both actually had rising household incomes during this period, and they rose about the same amount. But in fact, employment rose faster in Texas. So notice, not by accident, Texas is in red, California is in blue, right? So, that makes me think that actually teen restaurant employment in Texas fell relative to overall employment growth in California relative to Texas, right? Maybe you shouldn't make that inference, but the point I'm making is it's not a valid comparison. It's not a useful comparison to compare California and Texas because they really are moving in different directions. And this looks very reassuring until you recognize that in fact, Texas is adding a lot more employment. And so you might have expected employment in Texas to grow fast in California. Excuse me. You might have expected, let me just continue. Okay. So my interpretation of the synthetic case study is that clearly the California minimum wage increased California wages relative to what otherwise would have occurred in relative donor states and counties. I'm less confident in the employment results because I'm uncertain that parallel restaurant employment trends hold in booming California versus kind of the rest of low-wage America. Now, the Texas comparisons, unintentionally worrisome. Texas was adding population much faster. Perhaps the right comparison would be restaurant employment as a share of overall employment. So I recommend trying that normalization. So those kind of concerns might lead you to put greater weight on within California comparisons, which the paper also very helpfully does. So here is a figure of the median wage in counties initially, their change in earnings, and their changes in employment. And so you can see, reassuringly, there's no systematic relationship between the level of the initial minimum wage and the change in employment of restaurant workers. You might have thought where the median wage was lower, the minimum is more binding. Therefore, you might have expected this to be negative here. You don't see anything like that. Simultaneously, and this is what I'm puzzled by, and maybe I'm misunderstanding the figure, I also would have expected the earnings effect to be larger in the low-wage county states and smaller in the high-wage county states, and I don't see that relationship. So I'm a little puzzled by this figure, but again, I'm sure Michael will respond to that in his comments. So let me come to my last comment, which is, what should we actually expect by comparing low versus high-wage counties? It's natural to compare them and say, well, it's more binding in low-wage than high-wage counties if we compare Fresno to San Francisco, right? So one prior would be that employment should fall the most in low-wage counties because the minimum wage had the most bite there. But an alternative would be, well, it should fall the least in low-wage counties because these are the low-density places with weak employment competition and more exercise of monopsony power. So maybe the minimum wage actually has more room to rise in those areas without affecting employment. And maybe in San Francisco, actually, labor market conditions for fast food workers are highly competitive because there's lots of restaurants cheap by jowl. So, or some mixture of the two. So I think this is a question that's been raised by R and Dubé, probably pointed out to Michael as well. Clearly, there's a minimum wage somewhere in some galaxy far, far away that's too high. For example, in the Senge's paper, we saw the minimum wage appeared to reduce employment in traded sectors, even though it didn't reduce employment on average. So the question is, where should we expect the minimum wage to help versus hurt? If we agree that on average, we're not seeing much for it, there's got to be, the question is, we should refine our priors about where to look for contrast. Should we look at traded versus non-traded sectors? Should we look at rural versus urban labor markets? Should we look at jobs employing teens versus adults? So for example, it's possible to argue that the extent of monopsony power is greater in high-wage labor markets because high-wage workers have lots of firm-specific capital. They're not very mobile. They're not sampling outside offers very much, whereas teens are doing a lot of employment changing. So maybe actually jobs employing teens would actually be more competitive than others. And that this nice paper by Brian Segmiller argues that basically the extent of monopsony power is highest at places like Google and Apple, where workers are paid a lot, but very little relative to their marginal product. So let me just conclude. So considering those questions could help structure inquiry. So let me just conclude. So first of all, this is a lovely paper in a series of many such important papers. And Michael's been a pioneer on this and working for a very long time on it. The synthetic controls is using our state of the art. They're powerful, but they do have limits. I'm sure everyone is aware of that, but I think I am concerned about those limitations here. And finally, I think it's useful to consider what is the relevant dimension of heterogeneity for trying to ask where would we expect to find larger versus smaller treatment effects. And once you think about that, I think intuition actually is less obvious than it seems initially. Let me finally say that this body of work on minimum wage employment has really turned the tide. So this is, 3 AEA member surveys and then 2 from the Chicago Markets Panel. Do minimum wages substantially lower employment among low-wage workers? In 1978, that was 90% of people surveyed, economists surveyed. By 2015, that was 26%. So clearly, this has been a game changer for understanding. And I think this paper continues to push that frontier and may drive that 26% still lower. Okay, great. So now.
And David, I'll warn you that you're at about 14 minutes.
Oh, no.
So we have a little bit of flexibility, but if you can make it like 8 minutes.
Sure, this won't even be that long. So,
Okay,
I apologize for that. So now I'm going to speak about the paper that Johannes just spoke of, the labor supply effects of unemployment insurance for older workers. This will be a shorter discussion. I received this paper later and I'm less expert in this area. So there is a ginormous literature on the disincentive effects of unemployment insurance, as Johannes emphasized. The concern is unemployment insurance reduces search effort, moral hazard, efficiency problems. But there's an overlooked issue, of course, which is that generous UI may cause program substitution, in particular, this bridge to retirement. And it's funny that I didn't know that it's amazing. It's amazing how big this is and how little it's been studied. I'm sure among German workers, this is well understood. And in fact, I've had German economist friends mention it to me, but I've not seen any rigorous evidence on it. And so this paper studies the question of the substitution between programs, or basically using unemployment as a bridge to retirement in Germany over a 4-decade period. So I want to bring up a non-structural implementation of this paper, same insight, and just to because I think this is really just an example, and it both shows what's going on here and motivates what this paper does. So this is a paper from 2007 by Duggan, Singleton, and Song called "Aching to Retire," and it's about the relationship between disability and early retirement in the United States. So in the United States, in the interest of, I'll explain this briefly, the age of full retirement started to rise for people born in 1934, and it reached its maximum, rose from 65 to 67 for people born in 1963. This is a result of the 1984 Social Security reforms. And so as it did that, as it raised the full retirement age from 65 to 67, it increased the penalty for retiring early at 62. So at the start of the period, you would have received 80% of your primary insurance amount if you retired at 62. By the end of the period, you would have received only 70%. So it means that there's an increasing penalty for retiring early. But there is no such penalty for going on Social Security disability. And disability insurance has the same benefit structure as the US retirement program. It's actually just like taking a retirement, a full retirement, but taking it at a younger age. So what this paper does is it looks at the losses that workers are experiencing by birth cohort from this change in the policy. And it turns out to be substantial. So for example, for people who were born in 1939, just 2 years after the policy, they were losing about $3,000 in expected lifetime benefits for retiring early. For people born by 1943, they were losing about $9,000. So again, this is changing the incentive to transition to a different program prior to full retirement. And I'll just explain the main result, which is that here you look at the percentage of adults receiving Social Security disability insurance at age 62 by year of birth, and you look across these cohorts and you can see, it's pretty stable, it's trending a bit, not a big change. But now you look at age 52, and just as these cohorts start to be penalized for retiring early, they start to go on disability at an earlier age. And so this is pretty, I think, compelling evidence that in fact, this program substitution started to occur just as the incentives to take disability rather than retire kicked in. So this is very related to Johannes or Gudgeon et al. Paper, but of course theirs is a far more ambitious and sophisticated analysis. They're looking at a complex set of institutions and incentives. The incentives change across cohorts. Workers are forward-looking. There's uncertainty about reemployment after job loss. So as Johannes said, they develop a life cycle model of labor side supply decisions that describes these transitions between employment, unemployment, and job search. And the explanatory fit of the model is impressive. And this is, really not my area of expertise, but I found it quite compelling. Johannes put up this figure showing you how this retirement or the UI inflows spikes move with the kind of length of the period in which you can transition. And it seems very plausible that this pushed up unemployment among near retirement age German men at the time when these relatively generous rules were in effect. I believe the Hartz reforms was, substantially changed these incentives. Is something that my former student Brendan Price worked on in his dissertation. So I just have a couple of comments and I'm stop. So some questions that I was left with, and these are really refinements. One is that the question of whether employers collude in this transition to early retirement. And I strongly suspect the answer is yes. I think it would be really interesting to explore by looking at, for example, whether firms under financial stress disproportionately start laying off males who are at the transition age, right? Because they can do that, and in some sense, it's not that harmful to the worker. The state covers the difference. And so the model as written is just about the worker's decision, but I suspect there's more to it than that. A third question is, I believe that in Germany, the retirement rules and structure is different for women than for men? And if so, wouldn't that provide another point of contrast for this? It's difficult to find a counterfactual here, but in that case, you would have not an untreated group, but a differently treated group. So that would be useful for additional identification. Maybe it adds even more complexity. And finally, and this is really a side question, these rules would also affect joint retirement incentives. And there's a large literature understanding how couples make these joint decisions. So let me just conclude. So this is a great question. It's important, it's plausible, it's intellectually challenging. I come away convinced that this is, there's a lot going on here, probably a lot more at the margin than we normally see in studies of marginal changes in UI. This is a far more sophisticated analysis that I can do justice to here. As you can see, I've kind of punted on that. I apologize for that. I don't want to make the problem harder, but the model does just consider workers' optimal decisions and not firms' incentives. And I suspect that both are actually relevant here. And finally, we just conclude by saying this paper will be generative. It focuses attention on this plausibly first-order policy distortion that has somehow escaped research attention and yet seems to be kind of looming large, hiding in plain sight. Okay, let me stop there. I apologize for taking longer than advertised.
Thank you so much to David, and also thank you to everyone for providing such great presentations and really, really robust discussant remarks. I'm particularly impressed by using the iPad while drawing on it at the same time. It's my first time seeing that, and now I have to learn how to do it myself. So thank you so much. And what I really liked about this group of papers is that they examine sort of these broad structures in the labor market. So they weren't about necessarily individual worker characteristics affecting outcomes, but structural factors demonstrating how policy and firm structures are so relevant to informing worker outcomes. And I want to give folks who have a burning response to discussant remarks a chance to respond to some of those questions while we're waiting for a few questions to come in from our live stream audience. If any of the panelists want to respond to discussant remarks, you can just come off mute and do that.
Yeah, I'd like to, if I may. Let me start the video. Okay, so David, thank you for those wonderful comments, both great positive adjectives and also the very specific concerns that you have, and including some constructive suggestions about how to address them. First of all, the data do go through the first half of 2022 for the CPS and through the first quarter of 2022 for the QCW. So we are at $15 levels already. And in San Francisco, for example, and in San Jose and Los Angeles, we're more like at $16 to $17 by $15 by 2019. So I think the paper is not that deceptive in its advertising anyway. Why doesn't the binding increase over time? I think it's because, as maybe you were suggesting, there's been a big rapid increase in low-wage jobs wages in the last 5 years, even before the pandemic. And that's a very welcome effect. The graph that you reproduced from our paper is not a causal graph, it's just using the descriptive data. And so if other factors are increasing the wages in those jobs, which they did, then of course the degree to which it's binding would not be as great. As far as this being n of 1, I think that's a little unfair. That our paper really does a whole lot more than Card and Kruger, at least the original New Jersey, Pennsylvania paper did. I've kind of changed my mind about this over the years. I was one of those who said, oh, you can't just do case studies. That's why we did all those cross-border pairs. But in this case, it just seems very compelling because the synthetic control method is really persuasive, and especially when you can include covariates for these possible confounding events, confounding factors. So on to one of your main points, which is that Texas had a boom, say, in employment that California did not. Well, we do have GDP growth correction in GDP growth control, and it turns out that the faster GDP growth in California is all in the Bay Area, where we had a tech boom. Probably Austin has also had a similar tech boom in Texas. So I'm pretty confident that this is not because of other differences between California and the donor pool that are confounding our results the way that occurred in other papers. But I think we could do more to make that more convincing clearly. On the low wage versus high wage, high medium wage counties, in fact, we did, the line there that you drew negative is actually positive if you do the little OLS regression, but not very positive. We just didn't want to put a lot of emphasis on it. On monopsony, now here's where, I taught monopsony for decades, well before Alan Manning's book came out, and certainly after. And I'm really pleased by all the increased attention to monopsony. On the other hand, the monopsony markdowns, the wage markdowns are about 20%. And when you have an increase of 87.5% in nominal wages, or even if it's 40% in real wages, you probably have already overcome a lot of the monopsony power that firms had in wage determination. And so I think the mechanism, if I were to point to a mechanism for a margin, is the ability to raise prices in low wage industries like restaurants. And I've done a little poking around in a lot of fast food brands, prices in different states, and also full service. And there's clearly a correlation. I don't have a good enough data set yet to establish causality, but I think it's a pass-through to prices. And there are several other studies, including by your MIT colleague, Jonathan Parker, showing that minimum wages get passed on to prices in restaurants. And then there's, of course, Orly Ashenfelter's study of McDonald's. So that's, yeah, let me stop there. That's enough time.
Great, thank you, Michael. And then in case Johannes, I think Johannes might want to also chime in with some responses.
Yeah, just very briefly. So David, thank you very much for these very generous comments. We have definitely thought about this interaction between the firm and the workers, and we do think in many ways these are kind of joint decisions. I mean, there's certainly a lot of anecdotes that are very explicit collective labor agreements that basically pick age cutoffs for severance payments that allow workers to then use these sort of bridge to retirement ages. And we sort of think about it as, I think in the model is very, very complex, but we try to make clear that ultimately jobs get resolved when the surplus between worker and firm goes to zero. And that can either be coming from there's no real distinction between this coming from the worker or from the firm side. And so in that sense, we do think of that as sort of a joint decision. but are a little bit limited in terms of how rich the model can be. But it might be worthwhile doing a bit more on the reduced form, as you suggested. And I also wanted to say, we did do an entire reduced form for women. Women do have different retirement ages in Germany, which means you can't just combine the samples. But qualitatively, it looks basically the same for women. And then on estimating the model, we plan to do this for women, but it takes about 2 months to estimate right now in our computing cluster. And so there's a bit of a lag before we get to finishing this with the women. But thank you very much for these great suggestions.
And Benny, I want to see if you have any specific responses to discuss remarks.
I will just say thank you to Marta, and I agree with the comments. I think I also agree that the natural next step would be the AKM direction. One challenge there with the existing data sets is the matching of workers not to individual firms, but to individual establishments. And of course, getting access to the relevant data. But I agree that would be a very interesting direction. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I have a couple questions of my own. In particular, I want to pull together some research I know that Johannes is doing, that he's not able to divulge the specific results yet. But one dynamic I was thinking about for Benny's paper is the role of domestic outsourcing. And so just the broad change in the structure of the US labor market where firms are focused on core duties. So some of the industries that you look at may not be super inclined towards domestic outsourcing, but some of them could be. Particularly, I'm trying to recall the industries that you look at. I have notes here that I can look at, but some of them like healthcare networks, apartment management companies, maybe telecommunications firms, also maybe firms that are broadly impacted by domestic outsourcing. And so I don't know if there's a way to sort of incorporate that in at least your framing or your modeling, or if Johannes has any insight too about how domestic outsourcing might impact the sort of spatial dispersion of firms in this way.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that's a great point. Unfortunately, I don't have a way to measure it directly, but I think this is one of the key reasons that they focus on within industry inequality, because I guess a lot of outsourcing action is going on between industries. So focusing on within industries allows us to, I think, to an extent, to put it aside. I think it's a very interesting question. We know that a lot of outsourcing is happening at the headquarter level. So I think it's an interesting question whether what's the geographical dimension there, right? Is it happens in the same markets as the headquarters, or do you outsource from the other side of the country? In which case, maybe the geographical implications are less extreme. But I do think it's a very interesting topic to look into.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess two thoughts I have, and I haven't thought about it quite from this perspective as much, but I think for some types of outsourcing, especially sort of low-skill jobs that tend to happen on-site, like cleaning services, right, or security guards, those kind of things, the spatial distribution of the tasks doesn't really change with outsourcing. But my sense is that within those industries, there's also been, rapidly increasing concentration. That like some of these large service providers have grown quite rapidly, and smaller, sort of crowded out smaller providers. So that could also, in that sense, lead to changes in the within industry inequality between establishments. But I'm not totally sure. We didn't really investigate that part. And then certainly, if one thinks outsourcing about much broader types of outsourcing, especially high skill outsourcing, can change the location, right? If I outsource my human resource department, then that can happen anywhere in the country, and that certainly could have spatial implications. But yeah, I have not. We didn't try to look at that, so I'm not totally sure.
Yeah, great. That was really great. I just wanted to take advantage of the fact that we have your expertise here as well to talk about this other paper. And I'll ask another sort of question for a couple of the presenters, is specifically looking at how you might predict that COVID will impact these outcomes or has impacted these outcomes. So for Michael, I'm curious whether is there a threshold of economic shock in specific industries like COVID that we think could get to the point where minimum wage might have a bite? So it's, if you're losing 50% of an industry in 1 month, as we did in April 2020, is that the point where a higher minimum wage finally starts to matter? And then the second one I'll also ask at the same time too for Benny is the role of a lot of this headquarter labor. As you know, similar to what Johannes had just said, is that now a lot of this sort of the types of jobs that can be done in headquarters can be done anywhere. And so do we think that some of these trends might change the overall shape of income distribution based on where skilled workers can locate?
Yeah, on your COVID question, I was really struck in our results how quickly the recovery occurs in wages in restaurants and unemployment also, even though, which is consistent with kind of V-shaped recession that COVID, the lockdowns created. So I really don't have any other intuition about the longer term effects of COVID. I think it's, it's decreased a lot over time. I think we know that, but we don't know whether there's going to be more variance and so forth. But thanks for the question.
And Benny, it's sort of speculative at this point, but I'm just curious what you might think.
Yeah, no, I agree that the question of working from home could potentially change a lot of these trends. I think a big question there would be, how far do you go from the location, from the main location? So I do most of the analysis at the commuting zone level. Now, if people just go to work once or twice a week, but they still reside in the same commuting zone, so maybe the effect would not be as much. But if we'll see people starting to, if the cross-commuting zone work from home will be big, so I think it can potentially change a lot of these trends, and I'm interested in looking at it, in the next few years.
Yeah. And you had a note too about sort of place-based policies, and I was trying to think sort of what that would look like. And I know you probably aren't at that level of analysis yet, but like maybe something around remote work is where place-based policy could think through how to incentivize people to move in different places, given that you can do that. And David, I saw you come off camera. Did you also want to chime in?
Well, yeah, I was just saying, we, like, New York City has really already felt this, right? That the change in commuting patterns and so on, and also the reduction in business travel has, really changed demand for a lot of these downtown services. And that's the one. In New York, unlike almost other places, has not really recovered its numbers. I guess San Francisco hasn't either. So I think it's not, I certainly predicted that unemployment would be high among service workers after the pandemic, and I was wrong about that. Obviously we're at a very low unemployment rate, which is great, and all this wage pressure I think is a very good thing. The question, but I do think these changes in longer term allocation of work and so on will change the texture of cities, and I think that is going to be consequential and something to understand better.
Great, thank you. We have just 2 minutes left. I'm happy to keep asking questions because I really liked all these papers, but I also want to make sure if the presenters, since this is our grantee conference and it's a chance for you all to interact with each other, if you have any questions for each other on your papers, I want to give you a chance also to chime in. And if not, I will ask one last question. Michael, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, hold on. Yeah, I want to put in a, oops, am I muted? No. I want to put in a plug for Justin Wilshire's job market paper, which Equitable Growth helped to fund. It's a paper on minimum wages and Walmart's entry into markets. It's a very nice paper because he uses as his control of counties that Walmart wanted to get into were denied for various reasons. So it's a very tight control group. And it also looks at how federal minimum wage overcame a lot of the power of monopsony. So that's for Justin, who's my postdoc for the next 6 months. Thank you for supporting him.
Yeah, I really like that paper. We have a number of products on our website. We have the working paper, a column, and an issue brief that Justin wrote for us. So that's a good plug for some more Equitable Growth resources. So thank you everyone so much for joining. These were really incredible papers, a really robust discussion from our discussants in interaction with the other presenters. I really appreciate everyone's time, and thank you to the audience for also chiming in and joining us for our virtual grantee conference. And have a good rest of your day.